is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This episode number 507. My name is Marshall. I'm one of your Limited Resources, and joining me on the line all the way from the East Coast this time, it's our special guest, Ben Stark. Ben, welcome back to LR.
Hey, Marshall, what's up?
Not much, man. Glad to have you back on. Luis had important business meetings to attend today. The window was very close. It was only about 40 minutes off of when he was free and when you could come on. But when given the choice between him and you, I picked you. So. Well,
it's a good choice. Do important business meetings for Luis mean he found like a new Mexican restaurant to get burritos at or something?
Look, it's work research. I don't know. He doesn't tell me. But yeah, super happy. Yes, I think you might be right. Super happy to have you back on the show, Ben. We're going to be covering some really meaty sort of core limited stuff today. Like, this is the important stuff. This is the foundation, the stuff that underlies a lot of what you talk about on your stream, what we talk about here on this podcast. And if you're relatively new to the show, welcome. Thanks for joining us and taking some time out of your week to talk magic. Also, this is going to be a good one for you. You're going to learn a lot about the fundamentals of draft and how Ben sees it. And a lot of this is translated to what we talk about on the show as well. And if you're a longtime listener, we'll sit back. This is a great reminder. I sometimes have to remind myself that it's okay to talk about things that we've talked about on the show before, because it's good to kind of hammer these things home. Drafting's hard. It takes a lot of practice. It takes a lot of know-how. And just because we covered it once 3 years ago doesn't mean that everybody listening, fully has it. So I'm excited for all of that. First things first, so I got to talk about our sponsor, channelfireball.com. That's the place to go for all things magic related on the internet. One thing you can get there is the newsletter. There's actually 3 of them. There's one for Modern, one from Commander, and one kind of general one with Standard and some other stuff on it as well. You can go to channelfireball.com/newsletter to sign up for that, and you can just pick which of the 3 you want, 1, 2, or 3. It's just a little checkbox right there, and you'll get that weekly newsletter. It comes with some extra content and even some good deals sometimes. So please do check that out. The show is also brought to you by you via the Patreon. That's patreon.com/limited resources. You can check that out for any extra benefits or bonuses that you might get. All right, Ben, first things first, let's do a crack-a-pack. Let's get into M20. I'm curious to get your take on M20. Have you been drafting a lot of it on the stream?
Oh, just nonstop. The format is so fun. I've done like hundreds and hundreds of M20 drafts.
Yeah, I knew the answer to my question when I asked it. We got this crack-a-pack actually. I'm sure you've had this happen to you too, Ben, but it's so cool when you get somebody who follows your work and comes up to you at like a tournament or whatever to say hi. And this one was from Gabriel Ross, who's this young man. He actually gave us the pack in an envelope, and on that pack he drew a picture of Chandra Awakened Inferno and said to Marshall and Luis, "Here's a crack-a-pack from Gabriel." So Gabriel, it's really great to meet you and your dad, and I wanted to say thank you for taking the time to do that. Isn't that cool when that happens, Ben, when people come up to you?
It's super awesome. I love it because, of course, look, it's nice that we're able to make a living doing this, but none of us got into this, to make a living. And it's great whenever people really appreciate your work, when people love magic and are enthusiastic about it too. I mean, I love it. I hope Chandra Awakened Inferno is not in the pack, though, because that might make it a pretty easy pick.
Yeah, hopefully we get something harder. So let's get into this pack from Gabriel and see what's in here. First card out is Keldon Raider.
Fine card, playable. If I have to first pick it, I'm going to not be very happy.
You can be pretty unhappy with that. Angelic Gift. This is the 1 in a white aura that gives a creature flying, and it draws a card when it ETBs. Nobody ever plays this. You don't play this, do you?
I do play it sometimes, actually.
Okay.
A lot of the white decks in this format are kind of aggressive, kind of like white flyer strategies. And I don't think it's a great card, and I wouldn't even take it over Raider. But I'll include one in my deck a decent amount of the time, especially if I'm looking to play 16 lands and maybe have something that can help me find, at least draws a card, helps you find land drop 3 or 4 if you stall.
Yeah, it's interesting because a card like Angelic Gift is a card that on paper, it looks like, well, why not? Right? Like, it's relatively cheap. It replaces itself, at least most of the time, risk aside. And it even gives a relevant bonus. So flying is probably the best ability you can give to a creature. But it is weird how these cards just so often don't find a home, because that we call it a tempo loss, right? Like using that mana actually matters. And the times when you do get blown out, it's a huge blowout. And that risk is something that, humans are not super well equipped to assess. But yeah, I'm with you. You can throw this in a deck every once in a while. And
and even if you never get blown out, which you will sometimes, there's good instant removal in this format. There's a little bit more of a hidden cost. Like, just because a card cycles doesn't mean you get to replace it with a spell and you have enough lands. Like, if you play this card in your deck, you're effectively playing 30, let's say you're playing 16 lands, you're effectively playing 23 other spells and 16 lands, and one of your spells just gives a creature flying. So it's more like your deck is 16 and 23 than 16 and 24. So, I mean, there is still a cost. Just because a card draws a card, a lot of times that's going to end up being a land, and a land that you don't need. So it's complicated. But ultimately, if you're an aggressive deck with a few ground creatures, like let's say 5-6 ground creatures and like 7-8 flyers, then there is value in jumping your one creature that's stuck on the ground and things like that.
Would you be more likely to play a card like this if it was paired with like green or a color that produced a bunch of kind of high-powered but ground creatures?
I mean, yes, that logic is solid, but in this format, green generally tends to either be an aggressive elementals deck or a ramp style deck. I very rarely play like a green-white ground creature and white flyer beatdown deck. That's just not something that I really see come together very often. Right. So when I'm usually using that card, it's in a deck like white-red aggro, where you have some ground aggressive red creatures along with some aggressive white flyers, pump spells, and removal. And then I'm pretty happy to slap Angelic Gift on my one ground creature that's blanked.
Right. Fortress Crab is next. 3 and a blue for the 1/6.
Still Raider.
Feral Invocation. Where are you at on this? This is a 2 and a green flash aura that gives a creature +2/+2. It's a combat trick that sticks, but it's kind of expensive.
It's a reasonably good combat trick, but again, a lot of times green doesn't want combat tricks in this format because they're a ramp deck. So if I have like a green aggro deck, then I'm usually going to play at least one copy of Feral Invocation. If I have a green ramp deck, then I'm not trying to do that.
Right. Duress, no.
Not
Sedge Scorpion? Is Sedge Scorpion better than Keldon Raider in your mind?
Yeah, I'd probably take Sedge Scorpion over Keldon Raider. Sedge Scorpion is not amazing in this format. A lot of times people are flying over it or just doing super powerful late game, plus it dies to bow. And if you're drafting on Arena, you know you don't want too many 1 toughness creatures. There's bows everywhere.
No kidding, especially ones that cost you a full card.
But I'd probably still take it over Keldon Raider. It is a good fit if you're a green ramp deck to slow down the opponent.
Yeah, speaking of the bow, we have its friend, the Vial of Dragonfire, which you do see occasionally on Arena, but not nearly to the same clip that you see people piling up bows on a creature. Of course, it goes well with the Weaponsmith, which is why you see it.
Yeah, there's only 2 reasons I put Vial in my deck. I have a Weaponsmith. That's the good reason. I don't have enough playables. That's the bad reason.
That's rough.
You could do worse than Vial, but it should not make the main unless you have Weaponsmith, unless you're really just honestly short cards.
Right. Which happens fairly rarely these days. Zephyr Charge is next. It's 1 and a blue enchantment. You can pay 1 and a blue to give a creature flying.
Not playable. Yeah, you don't have that many creatures that you need to give flying. Angelic Gift costs 2 less mana to give the first creature flying. With the charge, you have to pay 2 and then pay 2 again to give a creature flying. And you don't even get to draw a card.
Right.
And you were just talking about Angelic Gift not being great. How many different creatures do you need to give flying to?
Right. Exactly. So not enough to justify Zephyr Charge, that's for sure. Okay, here's a card that people ask you, Luis, and I a lot on Twitter, what pick would you make here? And by the way, you are incredible at that. Like, you are so fast. Like, half the time, like, I feel like I'm on Twitter too much, and then when I check it, you've already answered like a lot of the time. So kudos to you for that. I think that's really
kudos
cool.
to me for being addicted to social media.
Yeah, or at least turning it into something positive, right? Like, you're helping people while serving your addiction. This card is one that you and I very often come down on the same place and go, just take that. And it's Leafkin Druid.
Yeah, I love Leafkin Druid.
Yeah, same.
Since the set came out, I had that as the best green common, better than Rabid Bite and Silverback Shaman, which are pretty close. They're both nice commons as well. This is a format where green is a ramp deck most often. Additionally, this creature is a really, really strong 2-mana ramp creature, a lot better than it looks. 3 toughness gives you the ability to block, like if they played a 2-mana 2/2 or 2/1 or whatever. But also, more importantly, I find in your land light draws that it's not that hard to have 4 creatures in play and then get 2 mana out of this when you really need and can use 2 mana out of this. And in your land heavy draws, it's never producing 2, and that's okay because you made your land drops up to 5 and you don't need it to produce 2. So Leaf Kindred's the kind of card that really overperforms.
Yeah, it's so good. I agree with you as it being the best green common for sure. It's certainly the best card out of this pack so far as well. Next is Battalion Foot Soldier. That's the 2 and a white 2/2 that lets you search up other battalions' foot soldiers when it ATBs.
Yeah, so cards like that are interesting. I think that, let's say you have 3 copies of this card. It's serviceable to play them. The thing is, just because you have 3 copies of it doesn't make it better than good 3-drops. Let's say, for example, I have a bunch of good cards. I'm not looking to make cuts all over the curve. And I have 5 good 3-drops, right? Well, you can't play 1 copy of Battalion. So if I want to play my 3 battalions, now I have to play 8 3-drops. That may be too many. So if I have 2 good 3-drops and 3 battalions, I'll likely play the battalions because that gives me the 5 3-drops I want. If I have 5 good 3-drops and 3 battalions, I likely won't play any of the battalions because I'm not going to start cutting 3 mana like good 3-drops, just like 3 mana 2/2 flyers and stuff to put battalions in my deck. So I think Battalion is serviceable, but given you have to play all 3 of them or all 4 of them for it to be serviceable, you can basically only play them when you need them to fill your 3-drop slot.
Okay. Yeah, it's big commitment. And also, I'll note here, neither Ben and I are considering picking one up here. And that's kind of the strength of that as well, is that, you can pick these up quite late, really very late. People tend to avoid white quite a bit in the format anyway. And this is not, a particularly attractive white card anyway. So you really can get these quite late in the draft and sort of free roll and go, well, if I end up with 3 of them and I'm a little light on 3 balls, then I'll run them out. But just not a priority really at any point.
Well said.
So the next is our uncommons. Loyal Pegasus is first. This is the white 2/1 flyer that can't attack or block all by its lonesome.
It's a fine playable for aggressive white decks, and white is often aggressive in this format. I'm never taking it over Leafkin Druid. That's not close.
This one is. Well, or maybe it's not. Disfigure. Black instant target creature gets -2/-2 until end of turn.
Yeah, I think it is. I'm taking Disfigure over Leafkin Druid, but I think that they're relatively close. But especially if you're playing like in person or best 2 out of 3, when you get a couple copies of cheap removal like Disfigure, that really allows you to choose to draw first. And I think that's another substantial advantage because that gives you an extra card to work with on each of your turns. So if you don't have to worry about getting run over, then you can choose to draw, and then you're more likely to be able to play a land and a creature on each turn since you have 1 extra card on turn 2, 1 extra card on turn 3. But the big fear when you draw first is that you'll get run over. So cards like Disfigure and Shock go a long way in making it near impossible for someone to run you over.
Now, do you count a card like Sedge Scorpion in that same category?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you're playing against flyers, then Sedge Scorpion is a horrible card. But if you know that you're playing against like a green-red deck or something where they have to attack on the ground, Sedge Scorpion is a nice speed bump that makes it very hard for your opponent to run you over. Okay,
I'm going to push this even a little further. What about Loyal Pegasus?
No, I probably wouldn't count Loyal Pegasus that way because if you play Loyal Pegasus, well, no, not because it's white, because it can't attack or block alone. If it could block alone but couldn't attack alone, I might count it that way.
Okay.
But since it can't block alone, if they play a 2-drop, you play a Pegasus, you can't block. And then when you play something else, they may bounce or kill that, and then the Pegasus still can't block. And you're even further behind. You're looking for cards like Disfigure and Shock that will kill basically any card that costs 2 or less and even a lot of 3-drops so that they can trade up a mana or 2 and always just stop your opponent's early aggression.
And by the way, this does highlight even further, why we like Leafkin Druid so much. You mentioned it, that it can block, and it does. It often, blocks. And even though it's not 1 mana, it is only 2. And it it's great at doing both of those things.
If you don't badly need the mana from Leafkin Druid, don't be afraid to slap that in front of your opponent's 2 or 3 drop, especially if they're not black, because if it ends up trading off with a pump spell, that's probably taking your opponent's whole turn on turn 3, and that's fine. Then your 2-drop traded with a pump spell gains you some life. You untap, play a land, and play something else.
Yeah, you just don't want to get Blade Branded out.
Right. If they're black, you have to consider Blade Brand, and that's just always a judgment call you have to make based on how much you need the Leafkin and how well you can play around Blade Brand with your dip in hand.
Controversial card in some circles. Overcome is next. It's 3 green for a sorcery at uncommon. Creatures you control get +2/+2 and gain trample until end of turn.
So I actually think that card is better than it looks. This is a format where the games go long. You're not really under that much pressure that quickly. Usually you often have the ability to not make trades. So I think Overcome can be a decent closer for green aggro decks. Again, green is ramp more than it's aggro in this format. So that's why Overcome isn't that good, because it doesn't pair that well with Leafkin Druid and big creatures and stuff like that. But if you're drafting like a green elementals deck, if you're green blue or green red and you have an aggressive deck with Thicket Crashers and cheap elementals and Cloudkin Seers, just any of that stuff, then Overcome should be an auto include in that style deck. Additionally, Ferocious Pup gives you 2 bodies, and that's a common. So I think that Overcome is well positioned for any green aggro deck in this format. But if you're like a green ramp deck, then you probably don't want it.
Compare it to something like, another, like how about the monkey, the 5/4 trample monkey that draws a card when it dies? That card's much better. Would you just swap? Like, do you view them as occupying the similar space?
I would almost always take the Silverback Shaman because I think that it's just a more solid card. There's going to be games in this format where your opponent drew several removal spells and Overcome doesn't perform well, but Silverback's just going to always perform well. So I think that I would almost always take it. I mean, you could certainly concoct a deck where I wouldn't take it because you just have like 4 Ferocious Pups and you go wide extremely well or something like that, and then I would take the Overcome. But I think the vast majority of the time I'm going to be taking Silverback Shaman over Overcome. Yeah,
the crux of it for me is, like we like to talk about the quadrant theory here, like what stages of the game are these cards good in? And of course, Overcome has this glaring weakness where it's not good when you're behind, right? Unless you can steal the game, then that's fine. But if you're significantly behind, if your opponents remove most of your creatures, Overcome, will often just sit in your hand. You don't even cast it. It's so bad, right?
Yeah,
and that's what you were saying about the Silverback, right? That it's kind of always a thing, right? Like even if it's not like great at some points in the game, it's always going to affect the board and have a meaningful presence where Overcome doesn't.
We have a saying on my stream that I think sums this up really well, and it's been coming up pretty frequently. It's 1 isn't 0, with the point being like reducing your opponent all the way to 1 doesn't win you the game. It really doesn't matter if you win a game of Magic with 1 life or with 20 life, you get the same amount of match points. You get the same amount of credit for the victory.
Right.
So a card like Overcome, if it's putting them to 0, it can steal a game. It's a really powerful card, and that's why I'll play it in my green aggressive decks. But if it's putting them to 1, it may be doing virtually nothing at all.
Right.
So, Silverback Shaman is a 5/4. If you're behind, it blocks well. If it trades, you're up a card. It has trample, so it can't be chump blocked effectively. I mean, it's a pretty good card overall, like you said, in virtually any situation. I mean, not all. Maybe you're losing to flyers. It doesn't block flyers. But it's a 5-mana 5/4 trample. So that's, if you're trying to race, that's a pretty good rate. If they're holding removal, if they kill it, you draw a card. If you're behind, you can block with it pretty effectively.
Yeah.
So that's a card that the 1 isn't 0 principle doesn't apply. It's just going to perform pretty well. Whereas Overcome, if you're putting them to 1, it's doing virtually nothing. If you're putting them to 0, it's a game-winning card. So it's not going to always perform well.
Yeah, the way I like to think about it is, and this is, we're obviously getting into the theory here, but I like this. This is what we like to talk about on the show, is to try to really get into the nitty-gritty. Because, and let's say we shift the paradigm from am I taking Overcome or the Shaman in the draft? Let's instead shift the paradigm to, I have both of these in my pool. I have room for 1 5-drop. Which one do I put in? Now, you and I, of course, understand that there'd be a lot of context around that, right? what other colors you are, that, what type of deck you have, that kind of thing. But if we really just strip down what these cards are adding and what they're not, Overcome, what are the times when it shines, right? It shines when it wins you a game that, for example, the Silverback wouldn't have. Right? If you just go Overcome, kill you, and this was kind of the way that you could win this game, because otherwise you weren't getting through your opponent's defenses, with a single creature, a single common creature or whatever. That's the big upside on Overcome, right? It allows you to go over the top of a board stall or to finish off a game that maybe was starting to slip away from you, and a air quotes, a normal card or just a decent good creature wouldn't have pushed you over the top there. That's what you're getting with Overcome. What are you giving up? Or another way to look at it is, what are you getting if you put the shaman in, right? Because we view it as kind of a safe pick, right? That's a word you'll hear a lot. It's like, that's a safer play to put the shaman in because it's better on average in more scenarios than Overcome is. But Overcome is better at some other things than the shaman is. And the real question is, how often are you in a position where Overcome would win you the game and the shaman wouldn't, right? That's the gap. Right? Like if you show me a board state and you go, okay, you cast Overcome here, you win the game. And then we swap it out for Shaman. Instead, you go Shaman go. Do you still win that game? What percentage of the time do you still win that game versus what percentage of the time could you only win with the Overcome? And I mean, my guess is that it's not that huge, right?
No, the only common scenario in this format would probably be against Blue-White Flyers. If you're playing against a Blue-White Flyers draft deck, they're frequently going to be racing, hitting you in the air, and then they may have some bounce or frostlinks for Shaman while they're racing. But if you're able to play an Overcome, their creatures aren't that big. That's probably going to swing the race in your favor. Like if you're playing a green creature deck that's trying to attack on the ground, and they're playing a Blue-White Flyers deck with some bounce, some frostlinks, things like that. In that matchup, I think Overcome is going to be better than Silverback Shaman almost every time. But in all the other matchups, Silverback's probably going to be better more of the time.
Yeah.
Like Black-Red has so much removal in this format. A 5/4 body is quite effective in the green mirrors. Pretty much the only time that I think, you could create a scenario versus any colors, of course. But the only matchup, so to speak, where I would expect Overcome to be better, way over half the time, is against a Blue-White Flyers deck.
Yeah, super interesting. Because, of course, then your job as a drafter is to understand that is one scenario and that there are many. Right. And
yeah,
so
look to board it in. I mean, if you're drafting a green creature deck and you left it in your sideboard because you're pretty good at finishing, your curve's not that low, you don't go wide that well, you don't have multiple ferocious pups. So you left the Overcome in the sideboard. If you notice your opponent's playing an aggressive Blue-White Flyers deck and is going to be trying to race, then you may want to board in your Overcome. You almost certainly should board in your Overcome. But you may not want to start it very often because it looks pretty bad if your opponent's got a 6/7 removal Black-Red aggro deck with Chandra's Outrages and Murders and Shocks and Bone Splinters and all the great removal that's chilling in this format.
Exactly. Our rare, by the way, is Thunderkin Awakener. 1 and a red for a 1/2 with haste. It's an elemental shaman. Whenever it attacks, choose target elemental creature card in your graveyard with toughness less than Thunderkin Awakener's toughness. Return that card to the battlefield, tapped and attacking, and sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step.
I mean, it's an interesting card. It's not close with Disfigure. I'm definitely still taking Disfigure.
For sure.
But it is an interesting card. I don't think you need, since it's a 2-mana 1/2 and not like a spell, I don't think you need a million cards that it works with to play it. Like if I have a Scampering Scorcher in my deck, I may play the Thunderkin just for that upside. But I'm not taking Thunderkin over Shock or Chandra's Outrage. I'm taking it over a medium red card. You know what I mean? It's it's like the equivalent of a 6 pick for your deck, not a first pick.
Right. So that's it for our Crack-A-Pack. We're going to take Disfigure and move on with our lives. Let's get into the main topic here, Ben. Boy, buddy, it's been about 6 years now. You wrote what has become one of the definitive works on limited theory, if you will, an article called Drafting the Hard Way. And this is just my own personal curiosity, but did you realize when you wrote that people were going to latch onto it the way that they have?
Not really. Like I knew when I wrote it that I was writing like a good theory article that I would be proud of. I really like Magic theory articles a lot more than like, oh, this is the best common in this set, this is the second best common. I knew as I was writing it, like, oh, this is good, solid, like theory, good, solid abstract strategy. Like, this is an article I'm going to be proud of. But I didn't know it would really kind of become almost like, an institution or whatever.
Yeah, it's kind of your thing, man. Yeah, it is. And, I really love the name of it because it sums up a lot of concepts in a little bit of a challenge, right? It's saying, hey, this isn't easy. You're going to have to, do some tough things and make some tough decisions in order to make this work. But also you lay out very, very well why to do so and that it's worth it. So what we're going to do on the show this week is we're going to get Drafting the Hard Way from Ben directly. And also I thought, I don't really know, but it has been a while and they do change the way that they design limited sets, over the years. It's kind of a slow change. But if you take some snapshots from, say, 10 years ago to now, it is very different. They have made some pretty fundamental changes and you can see a lot of that pop up. So if there's any updates or anything you wanted to revisit or add on or take away or whatever, then this will be an opportunity for you to do that as well. So let's get into it. Look, the first thing is what's the broad strokes on Drafting the Hard Way? Why did you decide to write this, and what's the background on it?
Well, I mean, it's kind of, I grew up booster drafting. It's kind of how I figured out how to give myself a good deck in almost every draft. I guess a little bit of the theory behind it, or the theory behind why it produces the highest win rate you can. I think one of the fundamental flaws with the way people view Magic is they always want to go for the best, as if it's rock, paper, scissors. And if you're paper and your opponent's rock, then you win because you have what beats them. But that's not really how Magic works, right? If you draft the second best deck in your pod, you don't lose when you play against the best deck in your pod. You're just 48% or whatever when you play against them, or 46% or what have you.
Right.
So basically, if you can draft, like, let's call it the second or third best deck in your pod every single draft, that's going to produce a higher win rate than drafting the best deck in your pod 1 out of 5 drafts and drafting awful decks in 1 out of 5 drafts as well. And also, it's also going to produce more like, what's the word for this? Like, it's just going to produce the overall highest win rate you can.
Yeah.
And there's like a misconception that you can never 3-0 or something like that because you're going to lose to the best deck in your pod. But in reality, if you have a good deck in every draft, that's more opportunities to just get a little lucky in 3-0 because every single draft you're in it every single match, and it's not hard to win 46%ers. But if you have a train wreck in half your drafts or a third of your drafts, then you can never 3-0 because you have to get lucky like all 3 rounds, not the one time you play somebody with a little bit better deck than you. So I actually think like drafting the hard way, so to speak, just gives you like a good ability to 3-0 your pod. It gives you the highest overall win rate, and it's just basically how you draft optimally.
Okay, so let's talk about the way that most people draft, right? Especially not just by the numbers, but also just like sort of I haven't really thought this through. Nobody's ever really taught me. I just know I kind of like doing this, and they sit down to draft, right? When they do so, what are the things that you see that they're doing wrong?
Well, so fundamentally, every single pick is a decision point in a booster draft. Nothing else is a decision point. There's no reason why pre-draft you have to decide anything. You can make the same decision after you looked at pack 1 with more information, right? So your decision points in a draft are, I'm faced with these 15 cards. I now have a decision point. Which one do I take? Let's pretend you take Disfigure like we did out of the current Cracker pack we just did. Now you're faced with another pack. Now you have a Disfigure that you know will be in your final pool, the pack you're seeing, and then whatever the rest of the draft will produce. And now you have another decision point. What do I make pick 2 now that I have a Disfigure? So what you're trying to do when you're drafting is give yourself overall the highest EV, the best ability to win as many matches as possible. And every pick, you're trying to weight like what you already have and the likelihood that what you take out of this pack can be played with that versus how good that card is, like how much power it produces, right? Like for example, let's pretend I had a Disfigured, a Murder, a Cloudkin Seer, and I don't know what's another good blue common, a Frostlinks.
Man, I'm in for this draft, by the way.
Right, and then it's pick 5, right? And now pick 5, I get past a pack, and I look at a medium black card, Gorging Vulture, and I look at a good red card, Shock, right? So what I'm trying to do now is assess what is the likelihood the Shock makes my deck, because it produces no value for me if it doesn't make my deck.
Right.
What is the value Gorging Vulture produces in my deck? Because if I take the Gorging Vulture, it's my 3rd black card, so it's not guaranteed to make my deck, but it's a lot more likely to make my deck than Shock is if I take it. Shock is my first red card. But Shock is a lot stronger card than Gorging Vulture. If I end up with 24, 25, 26 playables in my colors, Gorging Vulture often doesn't even make my deck. It gets cut. It's a fine card, but it's a medium playable. Shock is a very efficient removal spell that I have never cut a single copy of from a red deck. So I know that if Shock makes my deck, it's going to produce a lot more value for me than if Gorging Vulture makes my deck, it's going to. But I know that the Gorging Vulture is a lot more likely to make my deck, given it'll be my 3rd black card, than Shock, given it'll be my first red card. Here, pick 5. Now, let's pretend that, on the other hand, this was pack 2, and we had 6 black cards and 6 blue cards that were playable, and we were faced with the same choice, right? Now Shock would still be my first red card, and we would only have 2 packs instead of 2.5 packs of draft left. If we're facing that choice, pick 5 of pack 1, we have 2.5 packs left to get red cards. If we face that choice beginning of pack 2, we have 2 packs left to get red cards. So if we face the same choice in pack 2, I don't know what the right answer necessarily is in either case, but I know how to evaluate the problem. I know that when we face that choice, pack 5, what we're doing is 2.5 packs left. Gorging Vulture will be my 3rd black card. Shock would be my first red card. And I'm trying to weight how good Shock is combined with the odds it makes my deck, how good Gorging Vulture is with the odds it makes my deck. Come pack 2, 6 black cards, 6 blue cards, 2 packs left. We're trying to weight how good Shock is and the odds it makes my deck, how good Gorging Vulture is and the odds it makes my deck. So that's the framework. You're comparing how much draft you have left, because that tells you the odds a card will be able to go on to make your deck, because you go on to see a lot of red cards and be able to draft red and switch into it with the power level of the card.
Yeah, it's interesting because in some ways you're weighing the immediate, right? Like you can actually, especially if you're doing this online, you can just look and say, well, let's say you're a little further down pack 1 for your example, right? And let's say you picked up an early, Chandra's Outrage in there too, right? But you've already got, you're pretty far down the pack here, and you've got a really nice blue-black deck forming, like the one that you described, with some really nice removal spells and some good efficient creatures. And in your mind, you're like, well, I'm not going to be in red. I second picked or first picked Chandra's Outrage, but it hasn't really been flowing and everything's looking good otherwise. And then that Shock shows up. And now you're like, okay, first off, you have to start thinking about a whole lot of things about, well, what's actually open and what's going on here. But also, just in a snapshot, you can look and you can say, would I rather have, a Murder, a Disfigure, and a good playable black card, or a Shock and a Chandra's Outrage? And then you can say, well, I think I'd rather have the black cards. You can look at your other color and say, would I rather have a Cloudkin Seer and a Frostlinks and some other good blue card? Or would I rather have these two? And that gives you just like a little shortcut to say, okay, if this is close, then I can sort of take the next step. If it's, in the ballpark of, because sometimes you go, no, I wouldn't. This isn't close, right? Like I really would rather have the cards I already have. And even though it's kind of tempting to look at this Shock, I'm good where I'm at and I'm going to stay. But a lot of times it's like, wow, a Shock and an Outrage, that's right up there with, a Cloudkin Seer, a Lynx, and maybe one other decent blue card. And you're thinking, and if red's open, because now that's where your mind has to go, right? Is you're starting to try to factor in the potential that you could get hooked up in red, since you are seeing such a good red card so late. That's a really interesting and tough balance to try to figure out in the moment. But I think that doing what we're doing now, kind of like a mental exercise, where at least you're becoming more aware of what the actual bottom line is with these. Like you're saying, you're weighing the power of it now, how it affects your deck, and then also basically the opportunity cost. What are you giving up by going for a card like this in potential down the line, or excuse me, by not going for a card like this in potential down the line for other cards? And you're trying to combine all these probabilities. Very difficult.
Yeah. So, I mean, I agree that's like an okay shortcut to use, but I think it's also, it's a shortcut. It doesn't really accurately measure the situation.
Yes. It is merely a litmus test. It's just a first step.
Yeah, because like that's exactly where people kind of go astray, because it doesn't include how much draft is left, because how much draft is left is the odds that you're going to be able to like switch into that color effectively and play that card effectively then.
Exactly.
And let's say it's pick 3. Let's say you have 1 Murder, 1 Cloud Conceer, and then you see Frostlinks and Shock. Well, Frostlinks and Cloud Conceer might be better than just Shock, but it's pick 3. You have virtually the whole draft left.
Exactly.
So at this
huge
point,
upside, right?
Yeah, like, you still have very high potential to be able to play red and to play your Shock. If, let's say, again, you face that same pick in pack 2 or pack 3, now you have a lot less draft left. So a lot less likelihood that you're able to move into the red. So while I agree that's a good way to shortcut it, I think what you're really looking for is a combination of like how likely I am to be able to play the card, which is mostly how much draft I have left, and combined with how many cards in that color I have. Because like you said, sometimes you start with a card and you bury it, right? Maybe you first pick Chandra's Outrage, then you got 3 blue cards, 3 black cards, and now you're looking here 8th pick. It's probably not going to be Shock if it's 8th pick, but let's say you're looking at a good red common like Goblin Smuggler or something, and there's like, I don't know, a blue filler card that you don't expect to make your deck, but it could. I have to think about the blue commons to come up with something that's like I cut frequently, but sometimes makes it.
Yeah, whatever. Don't sweat the
detail. It doesn't matter. You get the point. Something like Gorging Vulture. I could have just chose black and Gorging Vulture though, because that one's already there. Let's say you first pick Chandra's Outrage and you have 3 blue and 3 black cards, and then 8th pick you look at Goblin Smuggler and Gorging Vulture. It's tempting to take the Vulture because you have 3 blue and 3 black. But again, you have to remember, this would give you not only Smuggler, but it would give you Outrage and Smuggler. And you still have 2 whole packs left. So you might open a broken red rare or uncommon Chandra, which I think is the second best uncommon in the set in pack 2. So there's always a lot to consider, but I think that's the equation. I think it's how much draft do I have left? Because that really influences the likelihood that this color materializes for me. What is the power level of the card versus the likelihood I'll play the other card I'm looking at, and how powerful that card is. And that's what drafting the hard way is all about.
Right. And, I'll add one other variable that I personally throw in, I assume you do as well, which is that, one of the factors that we're talking about here is signals, right? Something that gets talked about a lot, about reading signals. Well, how powerful that card is that we slot into our example matters, right? Like if we upgrade that Shock to a Chandra's Outrage, I'm approaching this problem in a different way because I'm saying, okay, red has to be open at least in some capacity. Where with Shock, it could have been in there with an Outrage and the red player took the Outrage and the Shock ended up staying in the pack, right? And so that's like yet another layer to add on is, it's not just that there is a good red card, it's how good is the red card, right?
Yeah, sure. If you're drafting with experienced drafters, then you can definitely read very deeply into a pack sometimes.
I forgot that you draft only with bots now, but...
Well, yeah, so that's where it gets really interesting because while, I still think drafting the hard way is great today and the optimal way to draft today if you're drafting against humans, Arena is such a curveball, who even knows? Yeah,
that does make it a lot more difficult. Now, I want to contrast this, okay? Because you've given the listeners a framework, right? It's these are the... Now, look, the skill in it, right, is understanding. It's like I could basically put numbers into the framework that you're giving me, right? I could come up with a system myself to say like, well, I rate everything from a 0 to 100 and I put these probabilities in and I could I could make a model, like a spreadsheet type model to do that with. Okay. And the hard part is being right about those numbers, about understanding the cards, their strengths, how they fit into formats, what the signal is, all these different things. That's the fun part. That's the really interesting part. The framework is the part that a lot of people don't even see. And that's why I want to contrast this with the way that most people would draft, right? And that is take the most powerful or most attractive options out of their first few picks, and then they say, I am those colors. And that's it.
Yeah, there's just no reason to do that.
Right. And this is what you're doing. And look, that's drafting the easy way, right? That's sitting down and just you open up your first pack where there's no strategic influence on it. It's just the cards that have been opened. Let's just say you do take the best card. You listen to the set review or whatever, you have a good sense for it and you just go, okay, this is a bomb. I'm going to take this best card. And then the next pack comes to you where somebody did take something out of it, but you ignore that. You don't care. You're just looking at what's in front of you, right? You're not thinking in context. You're just like, what could possibly, what could I take here? And you take the best card. And then after 3 to 4 picks, you just start to lock in because all you're doing is taking these individual snapshots with nothing. There's no strategic layer being put on it. You're not extrapolating information from what you've seen. You're just simply looking at like a photo lineup, if you will, of cards and just saying that one, that one, that one. And then you look down and you're like, well, I've got 3 red cards and 2 black cards. I guess I'm red black, right? And this is drafting the easy way. Right. This is the opposite of what you're talking about.
Yeah. And listen, when I say there's no reason to do that, I'm talking about trying to get the optimal strategy or trying to get, the highest win percentage you can. Of course, if you just don't want to think and you're just, trying to have a fun draft and you don't care about giving up some win percentage, well, then that could be a reason to do that.
Sure. But then do what you want. But I mean, you are talking to our listeners. So
yeah. And
you know what they want.
And my point is because you still, like when I go into a draft, if I first pick like Chandra, like we talked about, 6-mana mythic one, that's totally broken, probably the best card in all of M20. So when I face a pick 2, it's not like I'm saying, forget that you have Chandra, because Chandra's really, really powerful, right? So Chandra makes me want to play red. But what I'm trying to do is still compare the chance that the card that I'm now deciding between makes my deck with Chandra as a strong pull towards red because of how powerful it is.
Right.
So you're still drafting the hard way still includes weighting what you already have. It's not like you only are trying to stay open. You're trying to weight the opportunity cost, the value in switching colors, and the likelihood of playing cards. So if I have Chandra, the 6-mana one, the likelihood that I'm going to play red is quite high because that card is awesome. It's not guaranteed I'm going to play red, right? Like if black is just wide open and red is just 6 people are drafting it in my pod, Chandra and 3 moderate red playables is probably not going to produce as much value for me as being the only black player in the pod and getting 2 murders and 2 skeletons and 3 audacious thieves and 2 bone splinters. But I am trying to play red if I first pick Chandra, the best rare in the set, not because I'm drafting the easy way now that I first picked a bomb rare,
right,
but because there's a lot of value if I get to play red because I get to play this card and this card is awesome.
Right. And that is a key subtle difference that maybe from the outside you wouldn't know unless you did understand how powerful those cards are. Because look, the way I like to put it, Ben, is it's the broken clock drafting method. If you've ever heard the phrase, even a broken clock is right twice a day, think about some of the other mistakes that people make when they sit down. They'll bring their own preferences to the table, and there's a lot of different types of preferences. There's color preferences. I like drafting red, white. I like drafting blue, green, right? There's that type of thing. They'll bring preferences that they've carried over from the previous draft format, which is logically makes no sense whatsoever. But, people do it, right? You get used to drafting a really fast draft format and you're like, all right, where's my 2 drops? Well, did you bother to see if this is also a very fast draft format? Because if it's not, you probably won't care about those 2 drops as much, right?
That's a really important point.
Yeah, and there's a lot of these types of things, these biases that you bring if you're drafting the easy way. And if you do bring one of those to the table and you say, you know what, I'm a blue-green drafter and I'm going to draft blue-green. That's what I do. Well, that's the even a broken clock is right twice a day drafting mentality. Because sure, there's going to be some days where you sit down and boom, the green cards, you're in the right seat for the green-blue. And you're the one who's already taken them anyway. So you're definitely not missing that boat. And boom, you got this amazing blue-green deck. And it's like, how did you even get a deck that great? That is incredible, right? And that happens sometimes, not very often. There's 10 different archetypes in most limited formats these days. That's only 10%. Every other time that your seat had the black-red deck just flowing to it, you open a good one, it's just, and you're sitting there taking green and blue cards and fighting the tide, you're coming up with a junker. And it's going to be really, really hard to compete if you're doing that.
Yeah, I think this goes back to a concept that I touched on where people really want the best strategy or something like that, because there's, like I said, this misconception.
That's
in
a
Magic.
Great point. Yeah, because this is another preference, right, that you could bring to the table, which is, I know this is the best deck, so I'm going to draft that.
Because they think if they have the best, they win, and if they don't, they lose. But that's not how Magic works. If you have the best strategy, then you're a couple % favorite to win, not that you do win. And that's assuming you're seeing it. There are very few draft formats, very few, almost none, where I would rather be one of 4 players drafting the best color than the only player drafting the worst color. If you could have 8 packs worth of all the cards basically in that color, because nobody else is drafting that color, and 24 packs, 8, for a booster draft, or you're fighting over a color with 4 other people, half the people in the draft. Like I said, there are very, very, very few draft formats where I would rather be one of 4 people fighting over the best color than the only person drafting the worst color.
Yeah, and you know how that goes. I mean, this is a difficult thing to communicate is nuance, right? Subtleties, gray area, right? People that are being taught or trying to learn will often try to grasp for things that are much more concrete, right? Like maybe you say, this color's the best color in M20. Let's say you think it's blue, right? You're like, blue's the best color in M20. So people are like, all right, I got it. Or conversely, white is the worst color in M20. It's the worst, right? And they don't bother, right, the person saying it and often the person listening to it to actually say, is it close, right? Like, are these quite densely, packed? Is the difference between blue and white not actually that much? Or is white way down there, right? There's a big difference.
When I was first bringing these concepts, let's say, to the Channel Fireball testing house back in like 2010, 11, 12, one thing that frequently people would get mad at me about is they'd be asking me, well, how does this format play? I'd be like, it's a really aggressive format. And then they'd see me draft a control deck or whatever. And they'd be like, but you told us it was an aggressive format. I'm like, yeah, I didn't tell you to force aggression. I told you that this format, weight aggressive cards a little more and defensive cards a little less because it's a format that it's hard to block profitably in. Right. Not like force aggro decks, and that was something that would happen multiple times with multiple people where like they would be like, but Ben, you told me X and now you're doing Y and you're doing actually the opposite of X, not even Y. And I'm like, yeah, but that was what was available in my seat. That was the best deck I could put together in this draft. Like, I wasn't lying to you. What I told you is true of the format as a whole, but that's a guideline, not something you're trying to force upon the draft.
Right. And it is interesting because I do think it really does benefit people to go just one step further. Like if I heard you say, well, white's definitely the worst color in M20, I would say, how much worse is it than the fourth color? Right. Because I want to hear what you say. Right? Like, I respect your opinion. I want to know what Ben Stark thinks. So I'm just want to ask you that question just to hear you go, oh, it is horrible. Like, it is not close. Or you might say, it just happens to be last, or you could say some people think green's worse, but maybe it's white, like it's close, right? That matters to me a lot, right? It's a big difference in how I approach a booster draft. If it's, way behind the rest, or if it's kind of just happens to be the last one out of the 5.
Definitely. I can only remember one time in modern draft history where a color was so unplayable that no matter what you opened, basically, I thought it was correct to avoid it.
Was it a green in, what was it, BFC?
You nailed it. Green in Battle for Zendikar. Yeah. I remember I was working with one of my favorite teammates of all that I've ever gotten to work with at the time, Justin Cohen, along with the rest of Team Ultra Pro. And, we might agree or disagree on avoiding the worst color depending on how good or bad it was. But I remember that time, Justin looked at me and goes, you're going to come around this time, even by your standards. You cannot play green. And I was like, all right, like it's early, my eyes are open. I mean, green has been bad so far, but, I'll get back to you in a few days with, whatever. And then a few days before the tournament or whatever, he's like, so how do you draft green? And I was like, you're right. I was like, this is the time. Like, you can't play green in this format. It's too bad.
That is great. Okay,
that's the only time I can remember, though, in recent history.
That's the one that stood out to me, too, as a real outlier. Okay, so let's try to push people now towards how they actually do this. Okay. So if you're willing to challenge yourself, if you're willing to push your boundaries, to set up a little bit of discipline or a little bit of, mental effort here, you can set yourself up to actually have a pretty darn good deck the majority of drafts, right? Like kind of not close to the majority of drafts, right? I mean, I figure, like, when I watch you draft, I almost never see like an actual train wreck, like where I'm just going like, holy smokes, like Ben has, like, he's way short on playables, or he's 3 colors with no mana fixing and has to just run it, and that kind of thing. What percentage, roughly speaking, would you say that you can come away with something, in the good deck or better range?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I don't know a percentage, but over 90 for sure. Probably more like 95.
Yeah, that would be my guess
happen to everybody, but yeah, maybe 1 in 20 drafts or something.
Yeah, it's very rare. Okay, so let's talk about how some of the things that you can do to help move yourself in this direction. Okay, the first one is forget your preferences. Now, I want to go back to a point that you made a few minutes ago, Ben, because I do think it's important. Everybody drafts for a different reason, right? If this is I put the kid to bed, I'm finally off of work, dinner's done, and I just want to chill out on the couch with my laptop and throw a draft onto Arena. Hey, that's great. Like, seriously, I've been there. Some of that stuff, I get it. Like, I don't think that you should be sitting there attacking this as if it were your job if you're just trying to have some fun. But if you're like most of our listeners and you're here to improve, if you want to, make yourself better at this game, and that's what you're here for, these are the things that you can start working on to do that. So the first one is the ideal drafter doesn't have preferences.
Agreed.
That person does not have that. So if you love red decks, I'm sorry. If you want to win the most, that's out the door. You got to love white, red, green, blue, everything exactly the same. Or I should say not even the same. I should say in alignment with how good it is in the format and how open it is.
The way I say that is you don't decide what you're going to draft. The draft decides.
Yeah, perfect. See, this is why I had you on the show, Ben. If you prefer aggressive decks or control decks or grindy decks, that goes out the door. You have to at least be open to drafting these things. And look, again, you can turn this knob to your preferences, because you can still do pretty well by kind of sticking to one strategy, but you're not picking up all the equity you could. It's that simple. So if you're all about the aggro decks, it's time to start learning how to draft a deck that can stabilize a board and create repetitive advantage over the long term. The deck you love from the previous format, we mentioned it. If red-white was fantastic and you drafted it for 3 months, that's great. I hope you crushed with it. But don't come into the next format thinking that that's the thing, right? One of the things that really stood out about your article to me the first time that I read it, Ben, was that you were saying, look, don't bring your preconceived notions to the table. You have to be willing to start from scratch every single format. That's a tough mental hurdle. You don't want to have to scrap everything that you learned about the prior format, but you really do need to if you want to be, really great at this, right?
Yeah, experience will make you better able to judge things more accurately, but it can also be misinformation and bias you. Formats in Magic are very different. The way I evaluate each format is by looking at all the commons and uncommons, mostly the commons, and seeing how they're going to interact with each other, right? And some formats, the green commons are slow and flyers will really punish them. Some formats, they're fast and flyers will not punish them. Sometimes R&D does a good job balancing that. Like they know in M20, the green lends itself more to ramp and is slow, which is why I think you see 2 different spiders that are efficient enough to play at common, Netcaster and Mammoth Spider, because there's a lot of flyers in this format and green is on the slow side. So it would just get annihilated if it didn't have those. But basically what you want to do is look at the cards in each format and then start to draw your conclusions about that format. This is, you know what this is like? I don't know how many people who are listening are sports fans, but they'll say something like, you know, the 1998 Patriots lost to, you know, whatever team like 3 times in a row or something. And now we're talking about players that were not on that team, coaches that were not on that team. Why does it matter historically how one team did against another when none of the same players or even coaching staff are still there?
You do hear that. You hear, oh, they never beat the Chiefs. Never beat them. It's like, what do you mean never? What does that mean?
Like recently the same players, then maybe it matters.
Right.
And so the same concept applies here. If you're playing with completely different cards than you were in the last set, like just there's no cards that were in both sets, let's say, hypothetically. It doesn't matter if there's 1 or 2, but just for the point of this conversation, let's say there's none. Why does it matter if red-white was the best deck in the last format with completely different cards? It's not like it matters a little. It doesn't matter at all. The cards are different. It's similar to, you know, if the Patriots never beat the Chiefs in the 90s, well, who cares? None of those players are still on the team.
Right.
Well, if red-white was the best over the past couple of years or in the previous formats, who cares? None of those cards are even in this format, right? That doesn't have any impact basically on the current format. Like, let's look at the cards in this set. Let's look at the way they interact with each other.
Right. And that's it's a muscle memory. It's a habit. It's a ritual. It's a thing that you're used to. And that can be difficult for people. So that's one thing that you should, you know, maybe you could use the set review show as your palate cleanser and say, okay, before I hit play on this thing, I'm cleaning my mind out of all the cobwebs from the last set. You know, if there's no carryover cards or strategies here, you know, I'm going to just start over again. So that's another thing. Now, another big hitter here on how you can work forward on drafting the hard way is don't overvalue your first picks.
Definitely
right?
agreed.
I mean, that's huge, right? You know, you talked about it before about the framework to do it, but one thing that you will consistently see from players who are, you know, struggling in draft is that they will weigh that equation, even if they're trying to, they will weigh way too much on their first pick.
There isn't a perfect exact formula I can give you. Maybe someday somebody will solve it, probably Frank Karsten. But like basically, the more draft you have left, the more ability you have to navigate away from your first picks. So if you first pick a really good card and you're looking at your second pick of the draft, your third pick of the draft, your fourth pick of the draft, you should not be thinking about your first pick that heavily yet, because you still have the whole rest of the draft to find other good cards in other colors. As the draft goes on, you need to weight what you have higher and higher because you have less draft left to find other things that might be available. There's not a perfect formula. If Frank hears the show, maybe he'll solve it. That's math that's way above my head. But I can definitely tell you that every pick in a draft means a lot. And at the start of a draft, you still have the whole draft left. And then as you close in on the end of the draft, you have virtually no ability to switch. Like by pack 3, you should almost never be switching in pack 3. So basically, in the beginning, whole draft left, don't weight what you already have too heavily. At the end, not enough time, weight what you already have pretty heavily. And then in the middle, you just have to kind of make the difficult decisions.
Yeah, another, you know, an interesting sort of side point on that is, at least in terms of just pure information, right? Which is a lot of what drafting's about, is the information that you're receiving from the players around you, and to a much lesser extent, the information that you're sending to the players around you. And it's really interesting because pack 1, pick 1 is actually the one that carries the least information, right? Like, it doesn't tell you anything about what the table's doing. It simply tells you about what was in the booster pack. And so even though that could be a really great card because you're the first one that gets a shot at it, it is interesting to note that that doesn't actually tell you anything about the way the draft's going. It does influence the way it goes, but it doesn't tell you. So don't put on your blinders, right? If you open up a good card, great. Hopefully you get to play it. And a lot of cards, as you mentioned, Chandra, and some of the really best cards in the set, but even some just really good removal and stuff are worth, tilting your draft over to a bit. But keep your mind and your eyes open. Don't just think, well, I opened murder, I'm black. You're not.
Right. The big thing is opportunity cost too. Like even if you have Chandra, 6 mana, best card in the set, mythic, if you look at a pick between Keldon Raider and Audacious Thief, and you have your Chandra and 2 blue cards and 1 other red card, and it's pick 5, remember that if you take that Audacious Thief and you go right back to drafting red-blue, all you missed out on was a Keldon Raider, a card that's probably under 50% to even make your deck had you drafted it, right? But what if the next pick, 6th pick, there's some great black card or good black card because it's 6th pick, like Bone Splinters, and there's no shock, no outrage, no smuggler, no cloud conceer, right? Maybe now you're like, well, now I can take Bone Splinters over nothing, and I got that Audacious Thief. We'll see what's in pick 7, right? Whereas if you took the Keldon Raider, now you missed out on the Thief, and now you might take the Splinters because it's over nothing. But are you going to come up with enough good black cards where black ends up providing more value because you missed out on Audacious Thief, the second best black common, and you missed out on it at the opportunity cost of a Keldon Raider, a card that would likely not even have made your deck.
Oh, I see that all the time.
Yeah, you really gotta factor in the opportunity cost. If that was a Goblin Smuggler with the Audacious Thief, that might be a hard pick because that's a good red common, right? If it's a Keldon Raider, a filler red common, that's really not a hard choice because the opportunity cost is so low in that example.
Yeah, I've noticed that, especially when I was doing live streams, and I'm sure you get this too, where you make that pick and people are going, "You're switching to black? Like, what is going on? You were blue-red. Like, what are you doing?" Right? And, I call it taking a flyer, right? I'm just like, well, hey, like if black's going to end up being super open and I end up somehow in it, even if it's not super likely, I'd much rather have this excellent common in my pile than a card that's so unlikely to make the
right.
cut.
Even if you're only 10% to end up black there from that point and you're 80% or something to end up red, you're missing out on a possible 23rd or 24th card that you'll replace with a roughly equivalent 23rd or 24th card in exchange for like the second best common in that color. That's a good card that provides substantial value to your deck. So exactly. you have to weigh the opportunity cost. And listen, these calculations are tough. I know why people draft the easy way because no one knows the right answers to these questions, and that includes me. The thing to remember is when a pick feels so hard that you don't know what to do, there's probably not a lot of value in either direction. And it's not like if you make the wrong choice, you blow up your draft. And if you make the right choice, you win. It's one of these picks will produce 0.01 more expected value in wins than the other. So so you should not be scared of the framework of drafting the hard way, because when it feels too close to call, it's fine. There's theoretically a better pick, but you're costing yourself very, very little if you get it wrong. If you understand the framework well and the pick is just so hard that you don't know what to do, there's very likely not much value difference between the two cards.
That's a great point. Super important thing for people to note. Last few things on, getting you on the right track here to draft the hard way. Don't predetermine your path. Right? Whatever it is, I mentioned the preferences that you might have had, but don't sit down and say, I already know what color, what deck I want. Like
there's no reason to ever do that. You could do that. If I don't advocate doing that, of course, after your first pick or your first 2 picks, but if you did that after your first pick, it would be doing the same thing as doing it before the draft, but with more information. So, and that same concept basically applies to doing it after your first 2 picks or after your first 3 picks or after your first 5 picks. You should see how each pick you gain information. And so there's no reason for you to decide what you're drafting. Just let the draft decide it for you.
And that's really like what ends up happening in practice and what's really, really important. You're looking to draft a functional, solid, hopefully very powerful deck. And you're looking to do it over and over and over and over. And if you do that, you will smash these things because you always have something to bring to the table. And what happens is sometimes somebody forces something and it was open, so they end up with an absurd deck. That's going to happen. And sometimes you're going to lose to it. But a lot of the time, people that do that, they don't even end up with a functional deck. And you show up, with your solid 7 out of 10, maybe it's an 8 out of 10 or a 9, sometimes maybe it's a 6.5, and you will beat them. Because you can cast your cards, because you have a decent mana curve, because you paid attention to your colors and the needs of your deck and made some disciplined picks, but mainly because you were smart enough to stay open and to figure out what your seat wanted to do rather than trying to force it into what you wanted to do. And you're going to win you're going to win a lot of drafts. And you mentioned it earlier, Ben, but I think it's worth repeating that even if you have the third best deck out of the 8 in your pod, that does not mean that you get third place in the draft.
Right.
I think still win.
I think it's worth repeating one more time. A lot of the misconception that comes around these strategies in that spot is people go, well, okay, Ben, even if you're right, it would produce a higher win percentage, but Magic rewards, top 8ing and, 3-0ing and 0-3ing and spiking. But that's true. But the thing is, you will get, if you have a higher, you don't go 2-1 every time when you have the second or third best deck in your pod. You still go 3-0 because you get a little lucky. You hit a 46%er when you play against the best deck in your pod. And frankly, you still go 1-2 because you lose to one of the two decks worse than yours that you played because they hit a 46%er. Mm-hmm. It isn't like if you draft the hard way, you're by averaging like a 7, it isn't like you're taking away your chances to 3-0. I think you'll 3-0 more often because you just need to get a little lucky when you play against the better deck. But every single draft, you have a 7 instead of if you draft 10s and 0s or 10s and 1s or whatever, then you have a 5 on average. And so I think you get more 3-0s and you definitely get way more total win percentage by drafting on average a 7 than by drafting on average a 5. Even if a 7 is always 7s, even though it won't be, because sometimes you'll just get hit over the head with your first couple picks.
Right.
Like, I still draft the easy way, so to speak, when it's there. I always come in expecting to stay open and navigate the picks, drafting the hard way. But some drafts, I first pick a blue rare, get past a murder, then get past a cloud concealer, then get past an audacious thief, then get past an on-summon, then get past a bone splinters. I play blue-black, and I don't drop a single card.
Right.
I remember one, actually, after the Grand Prix Indy top 8, the one that I actually won in 2012, Luis was in that top 8 too. And he comes up to me afterwards. He's like, oh, I think I drafted really well. And I'm like, something like, well, what colors did you draft? Blue-white, because those were the best cards I was passing him. He's like, yeah. And I'm like, well, what did you first pick? And he's like, Asperia or whatever, the blue-white mythic
the
rare.
Blue-white gold card,
and I was drafting black-green, passing to him in that draft. And I'm like, well, I do think you drafted well in the sense that you drafted what you were supposed to, but I'm not sure that this is a good draft to test your draft skill when the person feeding you is black-green. And I know the packs I passed him. It was literally like the best card in the pack was blue. Then the next pack, the best card of the pack was white. Then the next pack, the best card of the pack was blue. Then the next pack, the best card of the pack was white. So that's why I thought the best deck he could put together in his seat would have been blue-white because it was a good archetype. I was black-green and those were the cards in the pack. So that when he first picked the blue-white mythic rare, it wasn't exactly a tough draft. But he got to draft the blue-white mythic rare, blue card, white card, blue-white, white card. Don't fight it. That's a good thing. You know what I mean?
Right, totally. And you'll take it. For those of us that draft a lot, right? When those ones do come around, it's like, all right, I'm into this, right? Like I don't have to do the heavy lifting. I mean, imagine just in that example that Luis had opened like a really great, say, red, black, gold bomb, some mythic rare, something like that, right? Now you start going, would he have taken a blue card second or a white card?
And I can tell you for sure,
I'm
not claiming I remember this draft perfectly from 7 years ago, but I could tell you for sure that I remembered like after that draft, like I thought he was supposed to be blue-white in his seat with me passing him playing black-green. So if he had opened a black-red rare and tried to stick to it and took like bad black and red cards instead of these good blue and white cards I was passing him, his deck would have been a lot worse. Like if he dropped his black red rare and drafted blue white and just had a good blue white deck without Asperia that he first picked, his deck would have still been very good. And if he would have drafted black red in that seat, his deck would have been very bad. So there's a lot of reward to reading the draft and staying open and taking what people are passing you.
Yeah, it's a good example. Anything you want to add, Ben, before we take off as far as drafting the hard way stuff goes? Any last thoughts? Has anything changed? I mentioned at the beginning. Is this stuff still all viable and relevant and everything?
I think it's all viable and relevant in any draft against humans. I currently do not have a formed opinion on how to draft best against the arena bots.
Okay, you're still working on that. Yeah, that's a tough one. Also, they change.
Which is also why I've been trying to not form opinions too much on it, because I imagine they're still being refined and things like that, and they're not really being used in any high level tournaments or anything. So at the moment, when I draft on Arena for videos, for my stream, whatever, I still just draft the hard way. I still draft like I would in person. if we end up in a world where they're like, basically, look, bots are always going to be updated, but we're happy with how they draft now. Like, we've done it. And then draft ends up being part of big tournaments. Arena draft with bots ends up being part of big tournaments. I may try and reevaluate how do I draft best against the arena bots. Mm-hmm. But that's basically the only update to drafting the hard way. Like, I think 6 years later, the strategy holds just as well as it did in 2013. I think it's still how you draft optimally. But of course, bots are a whole different game than humans. And I don't necessarily know how well it'll apply to drafting with arena bots.
Okay, well, that's great stuff. And hopefully very useful to our listeners to maybe get them on the right track. Again, if they're starting out, or just as a reminder, refresher, maybe inspiration, if you've been a little bit stuck in booster draft, on how to get you on the right track. Ben, talk to us about what you've been up to. You've been doing the stream. I mean, a lot of our listeners watch your stream. I view it as kind of a companion thing, in the sense that, like, your mindset's very similar to ours on the show. So people can kind of learn a lot of what we teach on here from you, because a lot of it we got from you, frankly. What have you been up to?
Yeah, I mean, a ton of stuff. I mean, thank you to everybody who's been listening to my stream, tuning in. I'm a relatively new streamer. I never streamed regularly before the contract this year, and my stream has just been super popular. And thank you to everybody who's out there, who's listening, who's tuning in and making that happen.
You've been killing it, man. Really have. I'm impressed.
Well, I mean, obviously that side of it, I learned a lot from you, so thank you.
Yeah, but you're the one doing it every day, buddy. I mean, you're sitting there in that seat and doing it, and people are responding. I love seeing it. I think it's great.
But yeah, so I stream Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday nights. I'm doing a draft. I'm doing drafts about 95% of the time. Otherwise, usually sealed. But it's draft almost all the time. And it's Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday nights at 5 p.m. Eastern. Usually goes till sometime between 10 and 12 Eastern. Mm-hmm. I made a YouTube channel, Benes_MTG, which is the same name I have on Twitch, Twitter, and YouTube. If you want to find me anywhere, super easy. I post my new draft videos on that YouTube channel. Got 4 or 5 up from M20. So yeah, my Twitch, we just talked about, my Twitter. Oh, also, I just made a course with Spikes Academy. I don't know.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, I don't know if how familiar all the LR listeners are with Spikes Academy.
Well, tell them what it is.
It's a teaching site. They've hired a lot of the best content creators in all of Magic. Paulo did a comprehensive Magic strategy course for them. Corey Burkhart has done something on Modern. Reed Duke has done something on Modern. Seth Manfield did something on sideboarding. And now I've got a comprehensive limited course up. It covers what we talked about on this show, drafting the hard way. It also covers what you're looking for when you're drafting a more aggressive decks, more mid-range decks, more control-ish decks.
Wow, this is great. This is something I think our listeners would be very interested in.
It covers key differences between sealed and draft, like what you're looking for when you're building a sealed and how to build a sealed compared to when you're drafting. It covers how to evaluate cards, as a basic guideline, how to go into a new set and have a basic idea of how to evaluate the cards for limited play, for draft, and for sealed. I mean, I'm not claiming I didn't miss anything, but it's meant to be a comprehensive, everything you know about limited in one place. You're not going to find anything there that you necessarily won't have heard from me or you, or a great limited resource if you've been following limited content for hundreds and thousands of hours. Mm-hmm. But it's one very well packaged, comprehensive limited course that's meant to be all inclusive.
That is really cool. What do people see when they go there? Is it a bunch of articles? Are there videos? What does it look like?
The lessons are all video lessons.
Is it a class?
So, I mean, you could call it a class. It would be the equivalent of more of an online class, but I mean, it's not live. Mm-hmm. But it's video lessons. Spikes produced it. They handle the media side of it. The content is all mine. I wrote the words. I wrote the lessons. And then they just recorded me saying them. And so it's just videos, and then there's quizzes to check that you learned what you were supposed to learn from the videos.
Awesome. So that is fantastic. All right. That is great. Seriously, I think the people our listeners are going to really be excited about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty proud of it. It took a lot of hours of work to make. Organizing all your thoughts on everything you could come up with is not my strong suit. But I spent like a ton of time just thinking about everything, like drawing outlines and trying to put together this like comprehensive everything I know, like limited course.
It's a very big project, yeah.
And actually, they have like a Labor Day sale. So if you put in like code Labor Day, I think you get like some huge discount right now. It's like 40% off or something.
Wow. Okay. So LABORDAY.
I think so.
Okay. I'll get that from you. We'll confirm that, and I'll make sure that it's in the show notes. I'll also put a link to Ben's stream, YouTube channel, Twitter, and his Spikes Academy course as well in the notes. So if you're interested in this and you're driving, don't worry. We got you covered. When you get home, the links will be there in the notes, and you can check these things out at your leisure. Ben, thank you so much for coming on the show again. I love having you on, and I really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me. I love coming on. So anytime you want to have me, just ask.
All righty. I want to remind you that the show is brought to you by Channel. Was that a cat? Is everything okay with the cat?
My cat just knocked something over in the background. Just man.
I like how you say your cat, because there are 4 of them.
One member of my army of cats just knocked something over, and we don't know which, to be honest.
All right. Yeah, I know. I remember when in fact, I'll tell you that in a minute. We'll do that for the sign off. But I want to remind you that the show is brought to you by channelfireball.com. Make sure you sell your cards back to them. If you got a pile of rares that you need to get rid of, they'll give you 30% trade-in bonus on those if you're getting store credit, or you can just get cash. You can find everything related to the podcast at lrcast.com. That's going to do it for this one. We'll see you next time.
Bye.
Okay. Quick sign off for you here, Ben, because I know you got to go. But when I stayed at Ben's house for the GP last time, one of the cats, I woke up every morning with one of the cats laying on my legs, and I love this cat. And I was like, which one is this? And Ben told me, and then Rachel told me, no, that's the other one. And then we had to look at cell phone footage that I took of the cat to try to figure out which one it is. Because Ben has 4 cats, and 2 of them are like twins. They're indistinguishable.
So Rachel was probably right. In the dark, I'd bet on whatever she said.
Okay. But, I just thought it was funny that you didn't know which cat it was.
Ariel and Lyra look exactly the same, except that Lyra has a white tip on her tail and Ariel has a little bit of brown on her face. Yeah, but they honestly look exactly the same. Like, they both jump on my chair during the stream, and there's no way that people know whether it's Ariel or Lyra on the back of my chair. Yeah. They are virtually twins.
Well, they're great cats, and I love them both equally, Ben. So
come back over and hang out with them some more. You're welcome anytime, Marsh.
All right, man. I'm in.